Gentlemen, and welcome to the Liberia History Channel on Focus on Liberia. My name is Dennis Jai, and we are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. In tonight's edition of the Liberia History Channel, we're going to be looking at Firestone and Fernando under the theme Forced, in close quote. Well, tonight I have our presenter here, Carl Fambule, who is the chief presenter tonight. Carl, welcome to the Liberia History Channel.
It's always my pleasure to be here.
And we also joined by Jabari Darius Lamb, who is the co-presenter tonight. Darius, welcome to the Liberia History Channel.
Always happy to be on here.
We want to welcome all our viewers from across the globe. This is the Liberia History Channel, where we discuss Liberian history, our history, and who is best to tell our story. We tell our own story, right?
Yes.
So I'm very happy that we are here. We're going to talk about two important, events or happenings or things in the lives of Liberian. And these things are very, very important. Even today, the name Firestone is part of our history, it's even part of us. And of course, Fernando Paul. The way my people call Firestone in my town, we say Firestone. I don't know why they put the S. They say Firestone. And then Fernando Paul, we say Nah Paul. So those things are real to almost every Liberian. Jabari, welcome.
Welcome.
I want to first get your take how important it is to talk about these two, Firestone and Fernando Paul.
Firestone and Fernando Po are very important because they shape Liberia's current predicament, the situation that happened with Fernando Po in the 1930s, and what Firestone did when they established a foothold led to subsequent events, wars, and it still affects us to this day. So it's very important to understand Firestone and Fernando Po.
Because before I come to call to do with the same question, I want to ask all of you watching us, how much do you know about Fernando Paul and Firestone? I want you to be ready to share with us your experience either through text or on the phone. Call and tell us your experience or what do you know. If you have someone who was at Fernando Paul, a family member, somebody who worked in Firestone, or you live there, we have the Firestone or association here, everything Firestone. Please be ready to share your experience. Call. How significant it is to talk about Firestone and Fernando Paul.
I think it's still in people's recent conscious memory of this idea of being compelled to work without having the option to refuse. It's in people's consciousness and it's in people's oral history and people have to really understand what happened, and hopefully we can learn from these things. We still have situations of forced labor and human trafficking in Liberia. You've done shows about it. And if we don't learn about the past, we're doomed to repeat it. It's important that we dive deep into the circumstances that made this even possible. And also tell the truth about, who the actors were and the players were and who did what, when, where, and why. All of these things are extremely important. So we're going to do a quick overview, and then we're going to get into a discussion about what came out of it. The whole scandal with Fernando Po and why there wasn't a scandal with Firestone. So it's going to be very interesting.
Very interesting.
Yes.
If you are just joining us, welcome. We want to welcome our viewers from across the globe. This is the Liberia History Channel, and we're going to be talking about Firestone and Fernando Paul. Forced. People forced to work. Let's go into our presentation tonight.
Yes. So I titled it Forced, and I put forced in brackets and quotation marks because it's a relative term, and it's applied most often to Fernando Po and not really applied to the development of Firestone. We have to understand that in preparation for the Firestone rubber plantation, forced labor was absolutely used. And at some point, there was a labor shortage. And where was the labor going? Gold Coast, Fernando Po, working on the road, the Ganta Highway, the road that we call Ganta Highway today, the road that goes from Red Light to the Guinea border. So there was a labor shortage because people were being pulled in many different directions. So a lot of times people were being removed from the agricultural projects that they had been doing for generations and being forced to engage in other kinds of labor, often for very, very little pay and very terrible conditions, sometimes for absolutely no pay at all, sometimes at gunpoint, sometimes voluntarily going. And so it's a complicated story, but we're going to try to tell it the best we can. So this photo is an actual sketch from Fernando Po Island. And I used it on the cover because it seems to me that they're doing some kind of plantation work. And also, it's different kinds of people. I don't know if you can notice it from the photo, but the reason I liked it is it captured the diversity of the population that was used as labor in Fernando Po. They came from all over the place. And by the way some of the fabric, the cloth is tied around from the waist, it looks familiar to me, like how our Glebo and Clow and even Basa on the coast, you could tie them their cloth around their waist. So that's why I used the photo. Next slide, please. Any questions on this? Sorry, before we go on.
Yeah, you said they came from all over the place. Which place? Africa or Liberia?
All over Africa.
Hmm.
All over West Africa. So workers on Fernando Po Island came from all over West Africa. And so what we're going to look at right now is just a quick overview of, because a lot of people don't know what Fernando Po is or where it is and all of that. So we're going to get into it. But you can go ahead and we'll. So Fernando Po, also known as Fernando Po and Fernando Po or Fernando Po. This was a 15th century Portuguese explorer that this island is named after. He was an explorer and of West Africa. And as we all know, many of the names of our coastal places are Portuguese. So the same reason Fernando Po was called Fernando, today it's called Bico Island, but at one point it was called Fernando Po for a very long time, most of its history. It was renamed Bico Island after their independence of Equatorial Guinea, which it's a part of. But, you have Cape Mount, which was called Cape du Monde, which was Portuguese. You have Mesurado, which is, Montserrado, we mispronounce it, but Cape Mesurado is Portuguese. Cape Palmas, Portuguese. We've got Portuguese, Bassa, Portuguese, all along the coast. There's more than one Bassa actually along the coast. It means low-lying cove in Portuguese. So there's a lot of Portuguese words that we use along the west coast of Africa, and Fernando Po was actually named after a specific person. But the island of Fernando Po became inhabited by people of the Bubi ethnic group about 1000 BCE, so about 3,000, possibly even 4,000 years ago. I've seen, ranges, but the Bubi people came from the mainland, settled thousands of years ago, and developed their own language and culture. So they're not really even understood by the people who live on the mainland Africa. So they were very isolated on this island. And it wasn't until 1472 when Fernando Po visited the island. So he, Europeans will say he discovered the island. I say he visited the island. He was exploring. He went there, visited the people, and, was the first documented European to interact with them in 1472. This is important. We're talking about the year 1472. And these people had already been, to the Guinea coast, to the Grain Coast, all these places where we're from, before they ever discovered the Western Hemisphere of the world. So Columbus had not been to the Caribbean yet. He had not sailed across the Atlantic yet. and these people are interacting with Europeans. This is very important for people to put that in context. The idea that we keep thinking that we were some isolated population way in the 1800s and stuff. This is 1472. Liberia, what is now Liberia, was preceded as far as interaction with these people. So very important. The 16 to 1700s, the Dutch and Portuguese. This is 16 to 1700s. The Dutch and Portuguese. Oh gosh, I don't edit these slides, so y'all forgive me. They use the island as a transshipment center. And they use this island as a transshipment center for the distribution of enslaved Africans from the mainland. So they were using Fernando Po almost like a giant slave factory, where they would bring the people and hold them there because the island was more difficult to assess. If anybody wanted to rebel and try to free their people, the same reason they used Gore Island way up in Senegal is the same reason they were using Fernando Po. You would have to use boats to get out to the island. It would be easier to defend against attacks. If anybody wanted to come there and free the enslaved people, it would be more difficult because they're on an island. So that's what was done. It was both the Dutch and Portuguese that used the place for that purpose. In 1778, Portugal ceded Fernando Po to Spain. And Spain combined the island and the Guinea coast, which is now Equatorial Guinea, to be one Spanish territory, one Spanish, controlled territory. They too continued the slave trade. In 1843, so even after the transatlantic slave trade was abolished in 1807, which means slavery still exists, but you just are not supposed to transport slaves across the Atlantic. But in 1843, the British built a base at Fernando Po and liberated thousands of slaves. And these enslaved human beings were not only of the Bubi ethnic group, because remember, they were bringing people from all over what is now Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, and that area, Congo, and they were, keeping them there. So thousands of mixed ethnic group African people were liberated finally in 1843 on Fernando Po. By 1855, the British relinquished control, or Spain regained control of Fernando Po, and they started using the place as a plantation, sugar cane, and then later on cocoa. Any questions on that?
By this time, 1855, Liberia is already independent.
1855, nobody was independent. What do you mean?
Liberia and
Liberia,
independent country.
Oh yeah, 1855. Yes, Liberia was a republic in 1855. That is correct.
Right, and sometimes if you think about that, I mean, all these things are going on in the world, and you have this small country over there say we are independent, and horrible things are going on around the country.
And they're going on because we look like we do. So the target of world aggression are people who resemble us. So it doesn't matter if you speak English and you wear nice, jackets and you're neat and you wear glasses and your name is Dennis and you're soft-spoken, you still look like us. So they're going to not have any respect for your humanity, because the process of enslaving African people was a process of stripping us of our humanity. And this doesn't happen, when people say, oh, well, other people suffered. This was a process of not just murder or war. This was a process of using pseudoscience, religion, any means necessary to strip us of our human beingness. And so even if you were educated and could read and write, your humanity was always questionable. You had no rights that other human beings were bound to respect. This is a drawing of Fernando Po Island in 1873. It looks like a little fishing village. And the thing is, the place was extremely diverse. There were still Bubi people, the original inhabitants were there. But again, because of centuries of people being brought from different places, it now becomes a very ethnically diverse place. Everybody is now speaking Spanish because Spain was, Spanish was the main language. So by 1873, when the sketch was drawn, you have various ethnic groups of people that have been brought together. Many of them don't even speak their original dialects any longer. They're all speaking Spanish. And they're all intermarried and intermingled. Fernando Po was also used, I forgot to mention, by the British when they took over there in 1843. Remember how we talked about the transatlantic slave trade being abolished, and any illegal slaves would usually be taken to Sierra Leone by the British and to Liberia by the Americans. When the British occupied Fernando Po, they also would rescue illegal slave ships leaving from Congo and what is now Cameroon and all these areas, Zaire, all these places, and they would bring them to Fernando Po. So they created a kind of another group of Congo people in Fernando Po, except they speak Spanish. So I thought that's very interesting because nobody talks about the fact that that island had these people who were uprooted as well and did not also have connection to their place of origin as early as the 1840s.
Strictly speaking, it is incorrect to call the Grebo crewmen, as, however, the people of this coast readily converse together, hold constant intercourse, and are remarkably like one another in physique, as in morale. They may be described as one, and the best name for them is that which custom sanctions crewmen.
Yes. So we've been over this. Crowd people are the people we call crew today. But depending on who the author is, they could be referring to Grebo, they could be referring to Bassa. It becomes a kind of bastardized term used for coastal people in Ivory Coast, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. It doesn't mean that they were all crowd. It means that some European didn't care if they were crowd or Grebo. But this particular author, who was a missionary at Fernando Po, wanted to make a distinction and said, listen, there's a difference between crewmen and Grebo people. The reason I'm bringing this up is because there's a long history of Grebo and crowd people going to look for labor along the African coast and also on ships, taking them as far away as Europe and the Caribbean and North America. It became a culture for young men to want to go off work, earn some money, and importantly, return home. So there is a coastal culture among our people of traveling to work. Next slide, please.
Crew non-maritime migrant labor, particularly agricultural work, had resulted mainly in unfavorable and, at times, dire conditions for workers. Crew who engaged in non-maritime work often went into contract for low wages, which contrasts with West Africans in colonial Southwest Africa. Examples of this type of crew labor are diverse and go back to at least the early 19th century. Jim Martin gave us an idea of the breadth of crew labor, including thousands traveling to British Nigeria in the mid-1870s or the work for the French on their failed Panama Canal project in 1880s.
Many of the people who went to Panama initially to build the French canal were what we generically call crew people. A lot of them were crowd, a lot of them were Grebo, some were Bassa and other ethnic groups. Even Vai would be considered crew. So laborers from the Liberian territory on the coast went to Panama to help build the canal. Many of them never returned. Many of their descendants are Panamanian today. Not descendants of enslaved people, but descendants of migrant laborers. And this is something that is going to be exploited in a terrible way later on. So what becomes part of a cultural practice of wanting to go off and look for work Many times it would go home, sometimes it would not. Becomes an avenue to exploit people who are not willing to go later. Because sometimes people say, well, this is what the people always did. No, even if Jabari wants to go work for, somebody down in Miami, and they need more employees, and they say, Dennis, Jabari's going, let's go. And Dennis says, no, I've got my family here, I'm not interested in going. Then they put a gun to your head and say, oh, yes, Dennis, we're going to go and we're going to pay you, you come along. And so coercion was not necessarily what was happening in the 1870s and 1880s. This was more of people wanting to travel and work. It was voluntary. Sometimes people were going because they thought it would be an excellent adventure, and then they would go and it was horrible, but they were not necessarily coerced by force to go. So I have to speak slowly so you understand the distinction. I'm not saying because they voluntarily wanted to go to Panama or British Nigeria or the Gold Coast that when they got there, everything was gravy. But when they were leaving to go, they thought this was a good thing that they were doing. And people went in mass voluntarily at that time. Next slide, please.
No, Corey, it's important you said that, right? Because coming from Sino County, where even in my lifetime, I saw some of the people in my hometown returning either from Sierra Leone or from Ghana, and some have even gone to Nigeria. So Sierra Leone, we call it Senon. Ghana, either Kose or Ankara, mini Ankara. And then Lagos or Nigeria will say Dikase. So I saw people who went there and came back. I mean, their generations, they were old now, but we saw them, right? So mixing that with Fernando Po, I was like, okay, maybe our people wanted to go, but since you made that distinction, that people were going even before this time.
Yeah.
So before and after, there was still an appetite to go outside of the country and work and come back with money.
Yeah, it had become a culture, and that does not mean that when they got to where they were going to work, that things were always as good as they expected.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I this is my attempt of doing a map. So this is a map from 1930. We're going to fast forward now. We're no longer talking about the 19th century. So we're not in 1870, 1880 any longer. We're fast forwarding now to 1930 just to look at the map. And this, of course, the blue is the only independent African controlled territory on the continent. By 1930, only the area in the blue on the west coast in Ethiopia, which isn't on the map, were actually controlled by Africans. The rest of the continent was under subjugation. There were two main projects. There's a little black dot by Nigeria. I didn't put an X there because by 1930, there were not as many labor exports from Liberia to Nigeria. Most of the people that were going in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, early 1930s from the Liberian coast, or I would say really stopped right around 1930, 1932. They were going to the Gold Coast to build infrastructure. Earlier, they were there building the railroads. They were also there helping to build Accra, to do the roads. Many, many, many Grable and Kru people went to Ghana for this purpose and never returned in the early 1900s. Yeah. Just became Ghanaian, just decided to stay there. Some of them still had ties with their family, would go back and forth. When you talk about people being in places like Takrady, this is this labor migration that causes, like Mary Bro, her family is connected there. This is how this happened. They went there to work.
Some were deported from Ghana, I think it was 1987 or around there. And they came to Liberia, deported.
After 50 years?
Yeah. Around 1987 there was. And from what I learned, that was the second group.
A lot of them are still in Takrady.
Yes.
the descendants of the people who went there in the early 1900s. So if you went to Takoradi or to Accra or to Gold Coast to work, anywhere on the Gold Coast to work, especially the railroad that went all the way up to the gold mines in Kumasi, if you went there to work in 19, let's say 1920, 1915, 1911, today, 2022, that's your great-great-grandparents, or depending on your age, your great-grandparents or your grandparents. So they're really Ghanaian.
Yeah.
The Big X is the location of Fernando Po. So you see the distance between Fernando Po and Liberia. It's a great distance.
Yeah.
I've heard people in the oral story say, "Oh, my grandfather escaped from Fernando Po and swam all the way back to Liberia." I've heard people say that in the oral story. Or my grandfather, what probably happened is the grandfather made it maybe to Harper and was able to escape and go back, to the interior where he came from, but not all the way to Fernando Po. Because to escape from Fernando Po and make it to Liberia was literally not possible. So it may have been somewhere, that they didn't actually make it all the way there. But a lot of people worked at Fernando Po on these labor contracts and afterwards would return to Liberia, with whatever they earned. But the two main ports that they took people from, of course, is Monrovia, and then you've got, this is actually Cape Palmas, not Harper. So Cape Palmas and Monrovia. Any questions on that? And then over here in the corner, of course, you know how these map grids go. That's the shape of Fernando Po Island.
Mm.
And it's a pretty good size place. It's probably about the size of Nimba. So it's not some small little island. It's a massive place. So Fernando Po is probably roughly the size of Nimba. Maybe, if that gives you some context about the size.
No, that's important to have that kind of picture.
Mm-hmm.
So, crew labor from the middle of the 19th century, thousands were initially recruited, but by the early 20th century, with near slave-like conditions for laborers on the island, crew were avoiding work on Fernando Po. One of the farthest flung locations of crew migrant labor was on plantations in British and French Guyana. Monica Schuller argues that this migration, which occurred mainly in the 1830s and 1840s, but generally ended by 1850, was stymied because Western crew leaders were becoming convinced that transatlantic migration was a mistake. They complained, first, that low wages and high living costs retarded crew saving and delayed repatriation. Second, that in British Guyana, crewmen developed habits of comfort and extravagance, thereby impeding readjustment to crew coast lifestyles.
I thought that was funny. We're quoting Schuller, who wrote a book called "Crew Emigrants to British and French Guyana, 1841 to 1857," and then he gives a very good background on the migration. It's an excellent book. It's available on Amazon, but he gives a very good synopsis of what would happen and why sometimes people didn't return. And it's also because sometimes when you're a migrant, you're not really coming from comfort in your home. You're not like an important person in your community. A lot of the people who tried to leave to go work voluntarily is because they were suffering. Conditions were not good for them. There were a lot of wars, tribal, inter-ethnic, inter-clan wars, and a lot of young people didn't want to be there to be recruited for purposes of war. There's testimony of people when they ask you, well, why did you, get on the ship and go off to go work? Like, I didn't want to be in the bush fighting war anymore. We forget that at that time period, there were a lot of inter-clan wars. And those wars will be fought by young men mostly. And you're going in the bush to fight war, risk your life. A lot of times you see your friends die. It was just better to leave for a lot of people. It was a better option. So they would make their way to the coast and wait for a labor recruiting ship to come. Next slide, please.
Right, and
Mhm.
somebody asked, the book is Crew Immigration to British and French Guyana, 1841 to 1857. Queer tales are told of worlds starting up in the presence of ladies, worlds which, fallen amongst an English assembly, who act like a 10-inch shell. Every traveler has made merry with the ridiculous names which the crew boys have borrowed for themselves from the English: Nix, Black Trouble, Salt, Water, Battle, or Beer, and Six-Fingered Jack. Yet their own names are by no means unpleasant or difficult to learn. None can I see the force of calling Kabui, Kofa, Taya, and Nkiti, Black Will, Two Glass, Sea Breeze, and Tom Brass.
So, um, oh, I forgot to put the year. This is from the year 1880, and John Clark, he was a Baptist pioneer at Fernando Po Island, and he thought it was necessary to point out that a lot of the crew boys on Fernando Po were calling themselves these things. Now, as I just illustrated, a lot of times these young men were of the age of warriors. Think about what was happening, the crew Grable Wars, all of these things, the interclan wars that were going on. If you left, you probably would have been of that class of people that had been fighting. So picking up these little cool little names and hey, my name Bado Abie, what's your name of it? So it was just the Europeans thought this was amusing. But I understand why they did it. I mean, even during our Civil War, people were picking up some of these really funny,
Yeah.
not funny, but different kinds of things to call themselves. So it just sounded familiar to me when I saw it. It's like, oh, I know people do that even in this modern time. Um, so this is the reason I'm emphasizing on the crew, the people that call the crew the coastal people, because they have that long history of traveling and returning with Western ideas, interacting with people in various places. So they're really, excuse me one second.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you are just joining us, this is Focus on Liberia. This is the Liberia History Channel with Carl Famler, Jabari, and of course myself. We are talking about Fernando and Firestone. Right now, we're talking Fernando. So, according to the presenter, going to those places and coming back started long before Fernando and that was in 1870 and so. So this thing was a culture for us, the coastal people. And when you hear crewmen or crew, those days they were referring to the crew, the clow, the grebo, the bassa, and sometimes even Vi, whoever was doing stuff along the coast. CREW crew, probably that's where it came from. Back to you, Carl.
Thank you. So yeah, it's just mostly our coastal people, and a heavy. Most of them were actually Crow and Grable. Majority were Crow and Grable, um, or Glable, and these people were not the only ones. So if you go to this, so later on when we start talking about the Fernando Po labor crisis, when we start running out of volunteers and it starts becoming a forcible endeavor, and you need, instead of we need 50 boys to come with us to French Guyana to go work on this thing, and you got 200 boys on the coast and they pick only 50 of the strongest looking ones, and the other ones who don't get picked get disappointed and go home angry, right? In this particular case, they needed so much labor that the volunteers that were waiting at the docks to board the ship were not enough. So now you need labor brokers to go in and look for more people. A couple of things were the reason for this. You had the European colonies building their infrastructure, which were labor intensive. So they're using forced labor in Ivory Coast to build Abidjan, to build the railroad, to build the colonial infrastructure, the extraction infrastructure. They're doing the same thing because they're there to extract resources. So it's compulsory work for all of the indigenous people of the colonies They're not being compensated, they're not being paid, but they're compulsory work. So they're having more and more difficult time getting volunteers to leave these places because they're needed by their colonial masters to do the work. They get to Liberia. At these points in time, Liberia is starting to build infrastructure. We're building a major road artery, which to this day, in 2023, is still the longest continuous road. It was being built back then. The Firestone rubber plantation, they have 1 million hectares of land in the rainforest that they need human beings to clear, mostly with their bare hands and crude tools. You also have Fernando Po, that had an old relationship of bringing laborers to their island from the coast of Liberia, now demanding people. There are not enough. So they start employing labor brokers. Please bring me workers. You have them go further and further in the interior. Next slide, please.
No cover. Who are these guys? They
Oh,
look.
did I pass those guys? I'm sorry. Okay. So this sketch is from Fernando Po Island. So it says crewmen of Fernando Po. And I don't know if they're actually crew or if they're Gravo. I don't know their ethnic group, but I know they're Liberian because that's what they call our people on Fernando Po. And this picture just made me smile because in some cases, some of the headmen in their towns were not dressing and bluffing like this. I mean, look at the hat. So if these boys got back after their labor contract, the small money they got, they're buying coats and hats, and they're sitting on that island, showing off. So after the period of labor contract was over, they would get paid, and they were free. They were basically free to go. And so there were communities of them. Some of them continue to be fishermen and other things. But these guys, if they had gone back to Plebo or somewhere like that, they were going to be, a big deal. I mean, they were going to get all the attention from all the ladies. It was going to be a big deal. They're going to bounce back home. So I don't really know if they ended up going back to Liberia or if they just remained and married local women and their descendants are Equatorial Guinean today. I don't know. But I just like the picture. That's why I included it.
I like that too. They look really healthy.
Yeah. But they're not. They finish with their work now. They're bluffing. They're not get paid, and they're settling. And that was the other thing. They could remain if they chose to. So this is a map from the same 1930 that supposedly laid out the ethnic groups in Liberia. It's probably the first accurate map because remember, it wasn't until Daniel Howard that they were even allowed to penetrate to even know who was there. All maps before Daniel Howard penetrated the northern central area just, had some generic ideas, but here they broke down the territories of these ethnic people. And then they also have the linguistic families, the Mende Tan, the Mende Fu, the Kru. Kru is what people call Kwa also, the Kru speaking people, or what some people call the Kwa speaking people, which include the Day Basa. Let's see, who else? I don't know who the Sinkon are. We know Sapo. We know, I don't know if people still call themselves Putu or not.
Right.
I don't know if people.
Those are Crown, Sapo. Yeah, Putu is still there.
Okay. Tewi. They've got Padibo. And they've got Chin.
Yeah, Chien is Zoedru area there. Chien.
Okay. Then you've got, the Tewi, I already said that, the Grable, the Marylanders, and then you've got the Crew, Boss, I already said Boss and Day. So that's the people that some people call Kwa speaking people or Crew speaking people or Crow language family group, the Grable Crow language family group. And then they've got Kra, K-R-A. They've got Gyo. And the Don that they call Gyo, I don't know who the Kra are. those people are actually more connected to the Crow language group than they
Right.
are to the Mandefu. But because of proximity, I think they were just miscategorized because the
And,
similarities in language have to do with trade and proximity, not history.
right. And we have a Kra in Nimba too. So maybe that Kra, and they are today they are in the Babli district area. So
Yeah, and that looks
probably
like
that
that's exactly where it is.
it's
So
probably
if
that
you look at the number of Kra people and the Gil and the Kra are actually more alike.
the same.
They're more the same.
Yeah.
So that they were wrong in 1930 about this, and
Yeah.
that's something that probably people need to correct. Ethnic the National Traditional Society, and so they've got the Ge. I don't know who they are, if they're still existing, or if we go by a different name.
Well, yeah, not sure.
And then you've got the Manu, which are my people, and it's just a sliver of us in Liberia. The clear space here, which is Zerikore, in Guinea, also has Manu people all there and Pella people. You go below that, there's more Pella people in Liberia, but the Manu and the Pella are in that empty space up there that's not any longer part of Liberia, which once was, but was taken away. And then you've got the Lama, of course. And the Lama, the Manu, the Pella, these are all related ethnic groups. Kisi, Bandi, Mende, and oh, that's Bandi. They said Bundi
Yeah,
and the
that's good.
Bandi.
Hmm.
I don't know if they're similar, related. I don't know, but we're all the Mendefu people. And then you've got the Bella, the Kisi, the Gola, and then in the center of the Gola here, you have a small pocket of Bandi. And then my in-laws, the Vai, are down here. They're all part of the West Atlantic. I'm sorry, the Mendetan people. Mendetan. So the reason I'm going through all of this is almost all of these ethnic groups were victims of the forced labor. Whereas before, you only had these coastal people who were, now there's not enough labor. So now the frontier forces are going in as far as Nimba and Bong County and the interior parts of Sino, which is places like Jidikin. All of these places are actually mentioned in the report, where they would go in there, and basically, either bribe the leadership or just bully the leadership at gunpoint and say, give us some people or we'll be back. So now you've got a force of people being, a coercion and a forcible removal of people who are now being taken um, into down to the coast to go work at Fernando Po. So this resembles slavery in many ways. And arguably, anytime someone is compelled to work against their will, it is a form of slavery. It is not necessarily chattel slavery, but it's still a form of slavery.
Right.
Were they paid? Yes. People were compensated. And when you go through the reports, they were compensated. But even if you're paid, if you're not working upon your own free will, even if they force you to work and pay you, it's still wrong. It's still inappropriate. This is what, unfortunately, was happening to African people all over the world, including the United States, at this period in history. So the reason I'm giving the global context is because what ends up happening is it's such an extreme example of hypocrisy that I don't really know what to say. So there's a few key players. You've got the son of former Vice President J.J. Ross. You've got Yancey. You've got Massaquoi. You've got all of these government officials who, because there's an economic embargo against Liberia, because the Europeans are tightening up building their infrastructure, refusing to trade with Liberia because if Liberia starts to trade with us, then how can we justify conquering the whole rest of Africa? So a lot of these guys who were children of merchants, very successful merchants, in the past, who now are being starved, use that as an excuse to become labor brokers and start doing other awful things in order to survive. While it was not a majority of people in the country involved, and it was just a small fraction of government officials, it happened. And they used their power to utilize the Liberian frontier forces to forcibly recruit people, not only for Fernando Po, but also for Firestone, to clear the rainforest for Firestone. They were using the frontier forces to go into the interior and compel people, often at gunpoint, to go and work. Next slide, please.
Yeah, before we go, I see the Bandi there in a couple of places, right? Has both West Atlantic and also the Medifu. So maybe those are two different groups.
The circle of Bandi that's in the middle of the Mendifu is colored like the other Bandi. Remember I said when I was bringing out, so there's a small pocket of Bandi people living in Boperu. So Boperu, the reason is a Bandi settlement in Boperu. If you remember the Benjamin Anderson episode in Boperu, Boperu becomes a big slave trading, trade raiding center, and the Bandi were some of the greatest slave raiders. So a huge group of Bandi warriors were controlling some of the slave factories in that part of the country. So even after slavery was abolished, it just remained there as a settlement.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. Oh, now I see the little arrow pointing to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So these are actual photographs of, this is after, so when they finished working, some of them went on to become fishermen and settle on, the coast of Fernando Po. These are probably Liberians. They call them crewmen, crew fishermen. One thing I noticed is the canoes don't look exactly like our canoes in Liberia, or maybe they did at that time. I don't know if that, do you know anything about that, Dennis? They just seem smaller to me.
The edges are so sharp and pointed.
Yeah, they look different, but they call them crewmen, so I don't know. But again, you remember what I said about the people being all mixed up ethnic groups, so you start to adapt other people's stuff, right? Yeah, and then they're all speaking Spanish at this point. So but the way they're dressed, especially the guys with the what do we call it? Yeah, the hats. They just look like how our people were looking at that time. You see pictures of Greywood Chiefs dressed like that. So now they have small mob. They want to dress up like the people, the big men, and they saw when they were growing up. But they do look familiar. I believe that they're Greywood actually, but they call them crewmen. But the only thing that threw me off was those funny looking canoes.
Yeah, the Fernando Post maybe. They don't
have it could be the booby people did the canoes like that too.
Yeah.
So.
The West African position as labor elite was cemented by the German colonial war and genocide against the Herero and Nama from 1904 to 1908. During this period, the colony's infrastructure and attendant West African laborers were essential in sustaining the massive increase in material and troops. While West Africans held an elevated position for the duration of German colonialism, it was precarious. This is because the colonial government and society, which put Africans at the bottom of the social ladder, could at any time strip them of their privilege. The First World War brought their precarious situation to the fore, resulting in their forced recruitment as auxiliaries for the German military and their accompanied loss of assets and possessions. Their forced adventure continued from the war's onset in late 1914 to the official surrender of the German forces to South Africa in July 1915. During the South African occupation of Southwest Africa, their economic position would not return to its pre-war status, and as mentioned above, this group, once integral to the colonial system, was rebelling against it by the early 1920s.
Yeah. So I put this in here because there's a lot going on with labor and labor crisis. You've got people who wiped out, there was a huge genocide of human beings in Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia. They marched, some estimate, up to 1 million human beings out into the desert and slaughtered them. You have all of this going on, and there's a huge demand for labor. There's infrastructure going on. The First World War, also during President Howard's time, took a lot of Liberians to fight in Europe. A lot of times, those soldiers did not return. I mean, it was just huge human capital depression. There was not a lot of people. So forcing people, getting paid to do forced recruitment became a way of making money. And for a lot of people, it was an easy way to make money. For Yancey and Russell, hey, we just send these boys, we grab some guys, we get paid for bringing them. It's all gravy, and the rest is history. We're gonna kind of breathe. I'm sorry, I'm taking a little bit long. I didn't expect this to take so long, but I want us to get into the crisis. If we can just stay with the slide. And I'm just throwing these pictures in there just because I thought I'd share them. But this is again crewmen at Fernando Po, the 1890s, 1880s to 1890s.
You guys are drinking and eating.
Yeah. I'm sorry, not 1880s to 1890s. These photos are from between 1910 to 1920. I apologize. I'm getting my times mixed up. So in the next slide is just some of the villages.
The houses are built Liberian style.
That's what I thought, But they said a crewman, and you can look at what they're wearing around their waist and the hats. If you can see them down there in the background, they dress like how you see the Gribble and crew chiefs dressed on the coast of Liberia.
Hmm.
And to me, the houses look familiar as well.
Yeah.
They look more familiar than those pointy canoes. And then this is a church at Fernando Po. And supposedly these are crewmen. I was going through the pictures every time I see crewmen, I'm like, oh, okay, I will share this one too, because once they mentioned crewmen, I would assume that it was somehow, it could have just been, they could have been Sierra Leonean or Ghanaian or something else, but I'm assuming that they're from our coast in Liberia.
So there was a church in Fernando.
It's a huge place, yeah, of course.
The gospel got to be preached, even on slave camps.
They have missionaries at Fernando Po as early as the 1600s. They had to Christianize and baptize those booby people that have been there for thousands of years. It's always, the churches always come first. So we're going to now talk about the Fernando Po crisis. My throat's getting dry, so I'm going to let Japari also join with this presentation. But there's a lot of demand in Liberia for land and labor. I wanted to give an idea, let everybody understand the history of not only Fernando Po, but our people, and the idea of traveling to work and return and obtain money and things that were not available to them, mostly because of the economic embargo that was being pressed against Liberia. So this is W.B. Du Bois. He was part of the those who were investigating the accusation of the Liberian government engaging in forced labor. Go ahead, please.
Looking at the Du Bois-Garvey's controversy of the 20s, it becomes obvious that Garvey, the Black Zionist in Patmos world, acknowledged far more clearly than did Du Bois the nature and reality of the West African Republic. J.A. Langley has written that the alleged differences between Du Bois and Garvey's concept of Pan-Africanism seem, on closer examination, to have been minimal. In his view, the Du Bois-Garvey controversy was not so much an ideological conflict as one of personalities and divergence on short-run political tactics. The goal was the same: black political and economic freedom. It should be remembered, however, that where Garvey and Du Bois directly confronted Africa in Liberia, they show considerable divergence. Both the representative of the UNIA and Du Bois got to see Liberia firsthand. Beside Garvey's supposedly grandiose experiment in utopianism, Du Bois' mythopoeic defense of Liberia appears even further removed from reality. Du Bois' functions as a propagandist was, no doubt, important and necessary, but the Liberian crisis shows that in the mid-20s and early 30s, his propaganda was highly unpragmatic, having little to say about Africa as Africa. The charge by Emmanuel Gis that Du Bois missed his opportunity to give Pan-Africanism a rational basis is unfortunately nowhere more clearly seen than in his failure to advocate more than the status quo in black-ruled Africa.
Yes. So, I mean, that pretty much speaks for itself. I needed to give the greater context of this need to attack Liberia. People, countries who are doing far worse things like mass genocide, killing 1 million people in the desert, people who are using forced labor to build railroads and cities, are now looking at Liberia and saying, oh, you guys are engaged in forced labor. And so the issue doesn't become whether forced labor is slavery. The issue becomes, oh, it's only slavery if they leave. There's nothing wrong with going at gunpoint into Ghana villages and grabbing people at gunpoint to make them work, because we're not making them leave the Gold Coast. There's nothing wrong with marching 1 million people in the desert to kill them to make way. Well, we're making way for civilization, so it's okay to exterminate human beings. It is not okay to take them off the mainland and take them somewhere else to work. Why are they putting this narrative together? Because, again, Liberia has defied white supremacy in the sense that they have remained independent. They have proven that they not only can govern themselves, but they can defeat Europeans in court and be able to protect their sovereignty through legal means. They have built a legislature which could not be bribed by the British. So we've established all of these things. How can you create colonialism and say that it's justified when the country up to now had the pinnacle of good governance amidst the most difficult conditions? And we've established that repeatedly on previous episodes. So Liberia is an affront to the idea that African people cannot govern themselves without European intervention. It is an affront to the idea. So they have reason. Now they've been given reason to attack Liberia's sovereignty. And I'm going to actually turn the next slides over to Jabari.
Right, and before we get there,
Mhm.
so you're saying Liberia is engaging in this Fernando crisis,
Liberians are engaged. Yes.
Liberians.
Yes.
And what was the role of the government?
So you had individuals in the government
Right.
who were Yancey. You had the son of a former vice president, J.J. Ross's son in Sino, who was a labor broker. And the crazy thing about this, Masakwe, who was also a labor broker and using the frontier forces to forcibly recruit labor, all of these people worked for the government. And so Masakwe, Yancey were all government officials and all had command of the not command, but they were all able to control the AFL and instruct them. I mean, not the AFL, the Frontier Forces, and instruct them to go and bring people. And
Yense
so
was
when they,
vice president, right?
huh?
Yense was vice president to King,
Yes, to
right?
King.
Yes,
Yeah.
to Charles D.B. King, exactly.
And what was Charles D.B. King's role? Did he say he didn't know what was going on, or there
We're
was no
he
government?
said
He's
he
the
knew
head of it.
nothing. He was, listen, Charles D.B. King at this point was the worst person to ever hold the office of the presidency. We have talked about G.W. Gibson and his failure as a president, but he was a good clergyman and a good man of God. But he just was not a good president. He was a good man, but he was not a good president. Charles D.B. King was not a good man in any sense of the word.
Hmm.
In any sense of the word. He is the first president of Liberia to care more about himself than the Liberian people. He's the first documented president of Liberia to put himself and his personal interests above the interests of the state. I've never seen all of the presidents that we've talked about. We've been doing this presidential series. You don't see this kind of treachery. Most of the people, in fact, all of the people who preceded him were decent human beings. They were not perfect. They were not, everybody has flaws, but they were incredible human beings, especially the likes of Barkley, who had just been president. Even Howard, who made some terrible mistakes. He put the country before his own interests. Now you have King. He is not accustomed to hardship. I call him Pretty Boy King. Nails always manicured, right? Pretty Boy King. Hair always laid. Pretty Boy King was not accustomed to hardship. The economic embargo was uncomfortable for him. His daddy, CTO King, made life easy for him. So he was not his father. There's no way. CTO King was one of those unbreakable men of history. His son didn't want any trouble. He didn't want to sweat. He didn't want his shirt to get dirty. He didn't want his hat to get any dust on it. He didn't want to go through hardship. So every decision he makes, he takes the soft road. He takes the soft road. And on top of that, he is extremely disrespectful to indigenous people. He is the very first Liberian president to openly be disrespectful. When I say disrespectful, I mean he did not have any type of regard for their rights and their humanity. Every single Liberian president before this point is talking about we need to expand into the interior, bring the rest of our people on board. We need to build schools and build more churches. When they become Christian, they will believe in the vision of Liberia. They'll give up their pagan ways and they will join us. Not King. Not King.
And we're going to get to King in our president's series.
Yes.
So with this, so he was kind of laissez-faire when his vice president, all these government officials were doing this.
Jabari, I'll let you say. I think he sent them. I think he orchestrated the whole thing. But Jabari, what do you think?
I don't put, when we look at King, understand King was probably the first Liberian and only Liberian in the time to have a vehicle. He was the one that said that Liberia, I'm the leader of Liberians, I'm not the leader of the Black race. This is the same man that was the one who was responsible for allowing Firestone in and basically allowed them to do carte blanche, whatever they want to do.
He was the one that allowed them to do forced labor to clear the rainforest. He sold Marcus Garvey literally for rice. Literally, but go ahead.
Yeah, this man has no conscience. Okay, understand. And he was the same one who would, in his later years, would work in Monrovia, would work in DC. He was that one who was basically irrelevant after his presidency. He wasn't somebody that Liberians remember, like, oh, we remember the greatness of King. This was the man that when he left, everybody was happy. Everybody was demanding for him to resign, not just internationally, but within the country. You have people like Thomas Jefferson Richelieu Faulkner, who is exposing this and demanding that he steps down. You have Liberian women that are demanding him to step down because of the situation that he's created. And he is the one that damages Liberia's image to such a degree that his administration is why most people have that negative view of Liberia. If people can perform you one Liberian president that encapsulates having a bad image, is Charles D.B. King. He is the president that, if you want the pinnacle version of evil, that is Charles D.B. King.
Well, I mean, we're being colorful, but the reason we're so disappointed, and I'm just going to the reason we're so disappointed and we're emphasizing this so much, and Dennis, you've been here for every president since Roberts. The things that Charles D.B. King says, we never heard those things come out of J.J. Roberts' mouth. We never heard those things come out of Stephen Allen Benson, Daniel Bashir Warner. I mean, the things that Charles D.B. King did, we never saw before. And when we talk about his presidency, we're going to get into it. I mean, there's some presidents that we've had during our lifetimes that would have sold all of us for their own benefit if they could. But at that point in history, it was the first time that had happened, which is why the legislature impeached him. And much of the stuff he was doing was fully supported, especially the forced labor at Firestone. They just got angry that some of the labor that they told him to give to Firestone, he's giving to Fernando Po because Fernando Po was paying more. The Spanish were paying more. But go ahead, Jabari.
Right, and that's what I was going to ask, right? Because as you said, colonialism was around Liberia. They were practicing the same thing. And you also said the existence of Liberia in this was an affront to these people. So other arguments I've heard in favor of Charles D.B. King was they kind of tried to frame him. They tried to blame him and use him as a scapegoat, but they were all doing the same thing. And so
we'll get into that. I mean, they were doing the same thing, but they weren't. So they tried to do this during Stephen Allen Benson's time with the Regina Cooley ship, right? They were able to squash it and defend themselves and prove that there were no Liberians involved. Okay. This is the first time Liberia can't adequately defend itself because the president was actually involved. So that's the difference. He didn't have to do it. Other people stood up against imperialism for all the generations before him. And remember, between G.W. Gibson and Tubman, there are no presidents of African American descent. And so there's another thing that's making people angry, especially the legislature. They had no longer had any presidents of African American descent until Tubman. So the last African president who had African American ancestry was G.W. Gibson. Now you've got the Caribbean people. You've got Bassa. Now you've got Congo. You've got a descendant of Congo's recaptured Africans now in Charles D.B. King as a president. Recaptured Africans that came via Sierra Leone. So this is very outrageous to this population of Liberians who were disappointed in his conduct. Because here they were saying, oh, everything has always been ruled by the descendants of the African Americans. And now we've got, this Congo guy like ourselves, or this, and hold it, when the Caribbean people came, Berkeley was a superstar. He's one of the greatest African minds in world history. We don't talk about him much. Berkeley was a genius. you've got all these succession of great people. Even Howard, though he penetrated the interior and he was a man of war, he was not this sadistic. Those wars that Howard fought, going to, into the interior to try to incorporate the interior, his intentions were to hold the country together. Charles D.B. King isn't doing these things to hold the country together. He's doing these things to get rich. He's doing these things to get rich. And he's clear and concise about it. There's no doubt that his motivation was money, wealth. That had never happened before.
And speaking of Arthur Barclay, I don't know if the next slide is about it, but Arthur Barclay is going to play an important role when the League of Nations does its investigation on slavery and forced labor in Liberia. This is for Nnamdi Azikiwe, and Nnamdi Azikiwe was one of the great admirers of Liberia. He constantly talks about Liberia and the significance that it meant to him. He says, one wonders at the hypocrisy of the United States, which after failing to curb forced labor for private purposes in her territory, as was pointed out by the International Labor Conference, yet had the audacity to sign the Slavery Convention with reservation on Article 5, Section 2, which imposes sanctions on the very practices indulged in by the United States. If peonage is slavery and forced labor is slavery, the United States has no right to charge Liberia with slavery because the United States is a slave state. And what what Azikiwe is saying is absolutely factual. And again, this is targeted to Liberia because they want to see Liberia be colonized. Understand, Liberia is getting all this smoke, but nobody's holding Spain, that is responsible for Fernando Po. Spain's not getting any criticism. It's like Spain's not even a part of it. You have Britain that's doing the same thing in Kenya, in Egypt, in Sudan. You got the French doing the same thing. In the United States, you have sharecropping. Sharecropping is basically slavery by another means. You are living on land that you do not own. They are leasing you this land, but you're only having enough money to basically feed yourself. You're indebted. You can never pay that debt off. And so
if you try to leave, if you're a sharecropper, you try to leave, you'll get lynched, you'll get killed, you'll get hung from a tree.
Mm-hmm. They would have shakedowns for Black people trying to go up north. When you have Liberian Exodus associations, white people are going into the meetings, trying to disrupt them, trying to give negative views of Africa. So the United States is perpetuating this slave-like system, but is criticizing Liberia for forced labor that it's actively a part of, Firestone being part of the U.S. government and influential in the U.S. government.
And I want to also add that there was a legitimate labor trade. There was a legitimate, we skipped something, sorry, Jabari. There was a legitimate labor trade. So there was an agreement between Liberia and Fernando Po for legitimate labor, where how much they would pay the employees, for how long, and when they would be returned. The legitimate labor agreement with Fernando Po was nothing wrong with that. It was a way for Liberians to be able, because you have a financial embargo, a trade embargo against the country. The young people want to go away to work. In order to protect them when they go, Liberia put down laws and rules, put those rules in place and said, hey, to go to Fernando Po, it's a 2-year contract. You're going to pay them $1 a week. So all those things were established on paper. So going to Fernando Po in itself wasn't bad. What was bad was later on, people started being forced to go. So I do want to make that clear for everyone. But because people are going to another place to work doesn't make that in and of itself bad.
Right.
What becomes a problem is when you don't have enough volunteers and you say use the frontier forces and go drag them there. Go ahead,
also, the vice president for King, I read that he was a domineering vice president, right? So he can. Is it true that he was more like he was doing most of these things and not king? And that maybe that's why we have a history now of a vice president being parked in the garage.
Yancey was definitely the one doing. Yancey had married a Grable woman. He was in Maryland. His wife's father, I believe, was a paramount chief, and they were all involved in this, physically involved. He was on the ground. He was physically involved, and so King wasn't getting his pretty boy hands dirty. Based on the testimony of Yancey is why I'm saying the instructions came from King. But Yancey definitely is not absolved.
Oh, no.
King is responsible for two reasons. One, he was the president. The second reason is his own words. His own words. You know, he incriminated himself in his own words. There's I think it was either you, Jabari, Michael, or someone believes that even J.J. Dawson's death and some of the deaths of some of these UNIA people were all because of King. I don't know. But I do know that King was extremely violent when there were these uprisings on the Crew Coast. The Grable, they say the Crew uprisings, but again, it's mixed up ethnic groups of people that were fighting. I think calling it a Crew uprising is a bit simplistic, but it was when Liberians, there was an insurgency of Liberians on the Crew Coast. Harper in Maryland, Sino, these little pockets of insurgencies. Charles D.B. King was like, execute them. Execute them. He said bad sickness call for bad medicine. I mean, extremely violent. You didn't really necessarily see that. Even if a president was threatened, you didn't actually see the actual violence that you saw. It was Charles D.B. King that basically squashed the Crew rebellion permanently. After this, you never see one person open their mouth again on the Crew Coast to say they're fighting government. Because he wasn't there to sit under Palaver Hut with people and negotiate and say, okay, why are you aggrieved? He said, oh, they got trouble, kill them all. That's the difference. So when I'm saying he was different from all his predecessors, it was that kind of not caring about human life the same way that his predecessors did. Not seeing the indigenous insurgents the same way his predecessors did as aggrieved citizens. He saw them as people that needed to be exterminated.
Mm-hmm.
So there were a bunch before Jabari came in. So you had Padmore, you had Nandi Nzikwe, you had all of these people coming in to defend Liberia, even though there's a very strong possibility the president of Liberia was pulling the strings. Some people say they were framing King. He knew nothing about it, that Yancey was doing this on his own, and they were just blaming King so it would be higher up the totem pole so they could just condemn Liberia altogether. So most Black intellectuals at the time, most Pan-Africanists and Black leaders at the time did not believe that Charles D.B. King had any direct involvement, and that even if he did, he was responsible that the entire country shouldn't be punished for the behavior of a few people. And go ahead with Padmore, what Padmore said in 1941.
In 1941, Padmore wrote, I have always considered it my special duty to expose and denounce the misrule of the Black governing classes in Haiti, Liberia, and Ethiopia, while at the same time defending these semi-colonial countries against imperialist aggression. This carefully balanced position would have been eminent reasonable, but in the 1930s, it was increasingly difficult to maintain. For many Blacks in the diaspora, the choice was of the either-or variety: support sovereignty under the existing Black governing class or see the independence of Africa's only republic ended or diminished. The decision was not an easy one. If Liberia disappeared from the map, would this not influence the future course of decolonization? the perception of many Pan-Africanists such as Patmore, Du Bois, and Azikiwe, who returned to West Africa from America in the mid-30s, that the destruction of Liberian sovereignty will affect the future of West African nationalism is probably correct. The failure of an African state with a Western model construction who have been used for colonial apologists has an argument to delay African independence. The need for continued foreign tutelage who have been emphasized and played upon. If in the mid-30s the League of Nations plan had been accepted, or if Liberia had fallen under a European mandate, the country would have been under non-African supervision at least until the eve of World War II. The issue of independence might have well been in abeyance during the war, and one cannot say whether an independent Liberia would have re-emerged.
So this is very, very important. This is after the commission, and basically they're trying to say that Liberians can't govern themselves. You know, they have this slave forced labor, this slavery running around. We need to get them under a League of Nations mandate or a European mandate, preferably. So there were a multitude of countries that were trying to get their hands on Liberia. The two countries that emerged, well, you have France that's there. Obviously, they would have a neighboring country, a neighboring territory in Liberia to go with Ivory Coast and Guinea. Britain has a possibility with that with Sierra Leone. But the two biggest countries that want the League of Nations mandate are fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. The South African government under James Herzog even gave a proposal that says that to quench German ambitions, we will hand over Liberia as a League of Nations mandate, and basically an appeasement to the Nazi regime. You have fascist Italy, who just invaded Ethiopia, sends a mandate to the Liberian government saying that it needs to treat all Italian nationals with the benefits of Liberian citizenship. So this is why you have Black leaders like Mamie Mina, you have Nnamdi Azikiwe, you have George Padmore, because they understand the significance. If Liberia goes under European control, especially one of the likes of fascist Italy or of the German regime, the consequences would have been unimaginable had that happened. Liberia, as Nnamdi Azikiwe described in his book Liberia and World Politics, 1934, he describes Liberia as the seed, the germination of Black hegemony. He's talking about Liberia. The seeds of Black hegemony germinate within Liberia. So I want people to understand just how significant that League of Mandate would have happened if the governments had said, you know what, Italy, Germany, you can have this territory, and it gives Germany what it wants, and then they no longer have to deal with the Liberia problem anymore. And then also, again, you had Abyssinia being attacked by Ethiopia. It being attacked by Italy. So at that point, there's no African country that's free anymore.
So it's also important. I just want to go back a little bit. When Yancey, I want to correct something. Sorry to keep going back and forth, but I wanted to say that when Yancey was conducting himself as a forced labor recruiter, as basically a slave catcher, he was actually the superintendent for Maryland County. So he served as superintendent until 1928. And James II Wesley was the first vice president of under
King.
And Yancey then took over after James II Wesley when this whole thing broke out. So when it was happening, he was superintendent. So that's why he had so much power to do what he was doing in Maryland. So when he was going to like your hometown and forcibly recruiting people, Dennis, he was superintendent of the county, and that's why he had so much control over the frontier force. Not during the time. So I just wanted, he was the vice president, but I just want to make sure everybody understood because I just got a text message asking me. So he was doing this while he was vice president. I said, no, that's not what we're saying. He did become vice president later, but when he was doing the forced labor recruiting, he was superintendent, not vice president yet. It just all came out in the investigation. Does that make sense?
Right. So what happened to True Wesley?
He was just replaced. We'll talk about Charles D.B. King's presidency and why he did that later on his show. on Charles D.B. King's show. Because that's a whole long story. I just wanted to let you all know he was superintendent when he was doing the forced labor, not vice president.
Let's see. No, that's very important. The global economic embargo against Liberia caused the rapid depreciation of the Liberian dollar in the 19th century. Consequently, Liberia was forced to adapt the sterling as a medium of exchange and store of value. This initially made it easier for Liberia to service its sterling-dominated debt and for Liberians to purchase imports from Britain. However, as economic exploitation of Liberia by the United States deepened during the early 20th century with the introduction of Firestone, the financial sabotage and economic annexation of Liberia caused instability and serious dislocations in the Liberian economy, ultimately leading the official adoption of the US dollar in 1943. So first it was the pound sterling, now is the US dollar.
So first, Liberia had its own money. And then because of the economic embargo, nobody would trade with Liberia. And they had to end up using the British pound. Remember, Liberia's history is a history of an oppressive economic isolation and embargo against the country. The same way this economic embargo crushed Cuba, this is what they were doing to Liberia and Haiti. So it flips after they Firestone decides it's going to economically annex Liberia. They go from the pound sterling to the US dollar. But initially,
yeah, you made mention of this economic embargo. What was this all about? Why was Liberia on an economic embargo?
Periodically throughout its history, the way to control people is to not trade with them. If you trade with them, you're recognizing their humanity. We've talked about this in many, many episodes, but essentially it was refusing to do business with the country so that they could be economically cut off, and that starvation would make it easier to manipulate you. Then you become desperate and have to borrow money.
And I want to add to that, it's also in the context of when we talk about Pan-Africanism. At this time, especially in the early when Liberia is formed, Liberia is the only independent republic. So you have to factor in, you're going up against nation states who have alliances with themselves, have other interests with themselves, and you're the only independent outside of Haiti. So it's hard to absorb those economic sanctions when you don't have those strong trading partners within your network. It's sort of similar to if you were trying to sanction a big economy that has networks, that has alliances, you can butt those sanctions because you still have trading partners and an alliance system. But when you're isolated and you have literally very few, if any, trading partners, your economy is going to tank because you don't have any alternatives.
And that's another reason why now the only thing we have for young people is to sell your labor. One of the things I wanted to point out, this picture with Edwin Barclay, the nephew of Arthur Barclay, from Barbados, sitting with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who bragged about installing a dictator after Barclay. To me, all the photos I see of Edwin Barclay with Roosevelt, he looks like he's in anguish. He doesn't look at peace. He looks aggrieved. I mean, look at this deep sense of worry in his eyes. It's almost like they know that this is the end. This is the end, like they have lost. And this picture, the anguish in his face. Herbert Hoover, who was president before FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, said he was going to install a dictator in Liberia. Said that's the only way. That get rid of the legislature. We got to put in somebody who can control. Roosevelt comes in, says the same thing. It's possible that that happens. But all of the pressure that was coming down from the US, this was it. It was like, okay, we've just seen all of these generations of David and Goliath, and David constantly winning. Now Goliath wins. This picture, this look on his face, captures the moment that they realize that Goliath has won.
I think you've given me the topic for my new book, Goliath's Victory, because it's terrible when Goliath wins. We always want David, right?
Yeah, and David had won under tremendous odds, and all the previous episodes we've been cheering, for David, because my God, how did they manipulate? How did they avoid this? And we were just constantly avoiding the tyranny, by the skin of our teeth. Bad things would happen, but we would always come out on top just for a little bit longer, and then they would pass the torch to the next president, and that torch.
And that's
this
why
was the last. Yeah.
And that's why, again, I know some people have different opinions, but that's the reason why, for me, Charles D.B. King will always go down as one of the worst, if not the worst president. Him is what leads to everything subsequently afterwards. Edwin Barclay.
Jabari will not be doing the Charles D.B. King episode. Just kidding.
Edwin Barclay.
We will not have Jabari on that episode.
Edwin. Oh yeah. You cannot have Edwin Barclay doesn't get into power if Charles D.B. King is not selling out for them butter biscuits. When you selling out for butter biscuits like this, it's bound to happen. You bound.
I mean, this guy, pretty boy Barclay. See how many people come and kill me. Let's go on to the next slide, please.
Let's go to D.O. Tue. The Barclay regime has D.O. Tue, an ex-member of the legislature, as the evil genius behind crew resistance. I repeat. The Barclay regime saw D.O. Tue, an ex-member of the legislature, as the evil genius behind crew resistance. D.Tue viewed himself as the chief spokesman of his people. As early as December of 1930, he had written to Charles Johnson, American member of the League's Commission of Inquiry, protesting raids on the crew coast. In April of 1932, he wrote to the American minister saying he feared deportation because of his role in exposing abuse on the coast and because of his absolute refusal to be co-opted by Barclay government. According to Tue, Barclay had made dire threats against educated Africans. On the 1st of May 1931, in the presence of the Honorable M. Massaquoi, Reverend D.W. Hammer, Mr. G.F. Sharp, Chief Made Boy, Dape Togba, and myself, President Barclay said to Paramount Chief Blogba Togba, I will burn down the whole crew coast if you don't stop talking about white men. Barclay, according to Tue, warned, you take it from me as an order and send word and tell your people that I say there will be only 2 months of peace on the coast and no more. When Tue attempted to interject, he was supposedly told, you damn civilized native who ought to be leading your people properly are misleading them. The British consulate had a low opinion of Tue as it did of most educated natives. In 1935, he described him as an astute but unscrupulous individual who had been expelled from the House of Representatives during King's presidency. 8 years before, the American League of Nations had made a careful compilation of the exact facts of Tue's life. He was.
So this is Edwin. This is Edwin Barclay, the last of the revolutionaries. Edwin was not Arthur, but he was definitely not king. And Edwin he as high yellow as he was, and contrary to what people believe, Edwin Barclay was not mulatto. He was from his both of his parents were from Barbados. He was a nephew of President Arthur Barclay, and he was really the last president that was not a dictator in Liberian history. But he had become so beat up and so broken and so frustrated because, again, Goliath is winning. They're trying to get everybody on board. He says, you know what, we're going to reach out. Dibotwe is a horrible human being. He's an enemy of the state, but we're going to reach out. We've got to put out the peace signs. We've got to all come together and save Liberia. Dibotwe is saying the white people will be better for us because if we have them, we can trade, we can be more prosperous. If we keep you people here, they will keep fighting us. They'll keep this trade embargo. We've talked about this conflict. And Dibotwe is also angry about the violence of the King administration. Rightfully so. Some of the violence was extreme. When you have insurgents, you put down those insurgents. You don't go and, you capture them, you imprison them, you do whatever, but you don't just massacre people wholesale. And there was a tendency for these people, because of the way that they were educated, to have high reverence for Europeans. They thought they were better than them. And it made Barclay angry. So I always thought my favorite line out of this whole thing is, I will burn down the whole crew post. I don't know if Barclay actually said that, but I think he did. I think he actually said that. I think Dibotwe was telling the truth. And I believe he also told them, hey, you damn civilized natives who ought to be leading your people properly are misleading them. Because he's a Pan-Africanist. He's saying you should be telling your people to be Liberian. Instead, you're telling your people to be British. What's the matter with you? And this made Dibotwe angry. He's telling the white people, he hates white people. He's telling us we should, you see the confusion there in the ideology, the belief system.
Edwin Barclay has to come in and clean Mr. King's mess. And see, this is what happens when you sell people down the river. You got to come in, try to fix it, and hold it together. And Edwin Barclay came to the realization, I'm going to have to hold it while I still can. And then after that, it's a wrap. It's a wrap. Y'all.
Yeah, he wasn't able to reverse what King did. And, as you can see in that previous picture, you saw the look on his face of anguish, because now King has put in a position where the country has now been economically annexed by the United States. So it's over. And Edwin Barclay knows it's over. And Edwin Barclay is telling Dibotwe, man, these white people are not your friend. Stop lying to your people. They're not coming here to make your life easy. But this is it. Edwin is aware. He's aware of what's happening, and it's tragic. The photos when he's there with Roosevelt, it's to me, knowing the context of how those photos were taken, how he must have felt. He's probably sitting there, Uncle Arthur, I failed.
And he tried. Like I tell people, he tried reaching out to people like Minty Malina Gore and the Pacific movement, the peace movement of Ethiopia, to see if they could get immigrants to come, to try to see if they could help. He tried to do what he could do, and it just wasn't enough. Again, you cannot.
He was appealing to African American leadership. He was trying to,
But you can't reverse that kind of damage. That King gave the European powers a silver platter what they wanted. They gave them what they want, and they took full advantage of it.
Right. So really quick, sorry, Dennis.
We're going to get to King. So because William is ready for you, Jabari.
See, you can't have me on the King show. You have me on the King show. There ain't gonna be nothing praising. It's gonna be no praising.
So William is say really City King or sell out. Wow. So Jabari, if you were around City King time, what would you advise him to do? We would like to hear your input. But let's keep that. Let's keep this within context, and then we can have CDB King.
I mean, I think William, I think, you know, it's personal for you, but you know, your ancestor is also CTO King. You know,
Yeah.
your ancestor is also CTO King. And that was he was, you know, he was a much greater, he was a better person. He was a
Yeah.
better person. I'm sorry, William. We're
Yeah,
talking about presidents
I'm about to
here.
say it's not.
I don't even.
It's just he's not. He was not that leader
I
like
I
CTO
mean,
King was.
we're not cussing all your ancestors, William.
Yeah, I'm about to
You
say it's just him.
maybe,
It's
you
just
know,
him. He's the only one that I
CTO King.
can't.
We'll do a show about CTO King so we can lift the King family legacy, because they do
Okay,
have a,
full
a,
disclosure.
a, a great
William is
ancestor.
a great grandson of Charles David King,
And the
and
great great grandson of CTO King. And CTO
right.
King is
Is the one
worthy
in
of,
New
of,
Jersey.
of a show all to himself. So we'll do that too.
Listen, listen.
Just so William can praise somebody else. So now the presentation, Firestone, basically what King did was he used the frontier forces to forcibly recruit people to clear the rainforest. Many of the workers that went to clear the rainforest, this is before the planting. You're talking about a old hardwood forest, and they're using very crude tools. Most of these laborers that were going to Fernando Po, that were going to build the roads, they were arguing even that the road project was too labor. They were using too many workers. They could get away with using a fraction of these workers. Well, in the interior, they put plenty of people to do something. They get finished. By the time it gets dark, everybody home relaxing, eating. Right? That's not our culture to put just a handful of people to do a lot of work until they die. So
Right.
usually you get the whole village together. All the boys will get together at work. They be singing, beating drum. They work very hard. It's over. Next, down the road, the next group takes up the road. They took some of those people to go clear the rainforest. People died. People died.
Carl, you keep mentioning the road project. Let me play a clip.
Yeah, play a clip. So I want to get, yeah, this is a clip of the road project. This is the road, the Ganta Highway that they paved over. This was built by the bare hands of mostly Mono and Pella people. Mostly young, very young boys, actually. Very young boys, mostly. There were men, but a lot of boys. And they were saying that there was an inefficient use of labor because they would have so many people doing one thing. Well, that's how we worked. You know, you can't have 2 or 3 people doing what you know, because it would be too much, it would be too difficult. And one of the things is, I call these the obedient ones. These are people who are used to this type of group work from being under these strong central authorities in the interior. So when the chief says, hey, we got to do this whole mile of road, it belongs to our clan. And then the next chief will say, this next mile belongs to our clan. That's how they built the road. Those roads that they built, all we're doing in modern time is repaving the roads that were built by these people, by their hard work. It is still the longest road in the country. It is still the best road in the country. The road doesn't flood because they dug down to the hard clay layer and removed the soft mud so that when it rained, you know, you didn't get the swampy effect. So that road is engineered better. You know, all these roads that got going to Lofa, as soon as it rains, your truck gets stuck because nobody dug down to the hard clay layer. So when you're driving the highway, those sides, those people actually dug that road all the way down into a deep trench to get to the hard ground. So when it rains, you don't have that muddy, swampy effect where cars get stuck. Before it was paved, and then later on they paved it, and the pavement lasted until the war damaged it, the mortar shells and things. President Sirleaf repaved it. So this is really important. I mean, this road was built by these various clans that live along the road. Batala, Salala, all these places. This slide is, you know, again, the village where the people set up to clear the rainforest, the hardwood forest. This was forced labor. The roads were not forced labor. The roads were by instruction, and instruction and obedience. Where you come from a culture, your chief said go build. Nobody got to take gun and put it to your head. Yes, our chief will build. And when they go home, they have rice, they have food, they eat, they relax. The next day they go back. When they finish their portion, that's it. They were not paid to build that road. They were not paid, nor were they forced, meaning they were not, no weapons were used to intimidate them. I call these people the obedient sons and daughters of the rainforest. When the big men talk, they listen. Firestone's a different story. They went into...
I saw somebody in there like a frontier force.
No, that was one of the Harvard expedition people. Oh, so remember, this was photographed and videotaped by the Harvard expedition team. So the frontier forces escorted Harvard expedition people, but they were not there to make the people work. They were just, yeah. I threw that picture in there just to make Jabari angry.
I cannot.
That's President. That's Pretty Boy King and Harvey Firestone. I'm just kidding. I'm really joking. Please don't take offense. That's President King and Harvey Firestone Jr. Yeah.
You got two devils, birds together, flock together.
So this is a picture of some of the rainforest that have been cleared by some of the forced laborers. There should be archival footage of these people being forced to do this, but of course, for many reasons, those things have not been released to the public. But this was horrible. They talk about the Fernando Po work conditions. They could not go after Fernando Po. They couldn't go after the Spanish because the Spanish would have said, look at what you're doing at Firestone in Liberia. Look at what you're doing on the Gold Coast. So the conditions at Fernando Po were better than the conditions at Firestone. People died in that rainforest.
Oh, I want you to say that again.
The conditions at Fernando Po at the time were more humane than the conditions at Firestone. When I say at Firestone plantation had not been built yet. They were clearing the rainforest for the plantation with forced labor. People died doing so. Many, many people died doing so. And they were doing so at gunpoint.
Understand the conditions at Firestone are borderline, I would say just straight up barbaric beyond belief.
And it's something that we don't talk about because we grew up seeing Firestone as a functioning plantation with workers getting paid. But before it became functional, they had 1 million hectares of rainforest they wanted cleared. And they didn't pay the people to do so. And it was President King who unleashed the frontier forces to drag people out there to do so. Because again, before President King, you don't hear any Liberian president dismissing the humanity of African people. Though President King's ancestors had never left the continent of Africa.
Displacing whole communities while this stuff was happening. It wasn't just, they cleared the rainforest and were displacing communities while at it.
Yes. So this is an aerial view right after these trees were planted. I mean, of Firestone. This is not mechanized agriculture. At one time in history, Firestone was the largest plantation in human history, in the world. The Firestone rubber plantation was the largest plantation in the world at the time, ever in human history. This Firestone rubber plantation, the largest farm on the planet, was cleared by the bare hands of our people.
Without pay.
They started to pay them later. Let me also say this. The Firestone you see where now you've got contracts and you're giving people money and all of this stuff. Once Liberia becomes economically subdued by 1943. So in the 20s, they were not paying them. By the 1940s now, they're giving people nominal wages and rice. They're paying them with rice and small money. And the small money that they're paying the people with, it's always enough for them to be in debt. They now start what is exactly like sharecropping in the United States. You pay them, and then you say, okay, this part of your pay is for your room and board. This one, you went to the hospital last time, we got to take this money out. And they're always indebted to Firestone. They can't leave because they need the labor. And instead of just paying them well enough for them to not leave, they trap them there with perceived debt, with fictitious debt.
Mm-hmm. And they're living in mansions on the hill. They got their private social clubs, segregated social
They've
clubs.
got their golf courses, which still exist. They had their vehicles. It was just like American style plantation. This land was supposed to have been given to African Americans to repatriate to. Mm-hmm. Instead, it's turned literally into a slave plantation. I mean, the disturbing irony of it all.
Mm-hmm.
So that's basically, Jabari, you want to talk about the Christie stuff really quick? It's getting late, and then we can.
Yeah, so the Christie report was basically the report. It had Charles S. Johnson. He was the Black American, that one of the three Black American. You had Cuthbert Christie. He was the League of Nations chairman, and you had Arthur Barclay. They all came to this report, and they couldn't really indict Liberia for slavery. They said, according to the Anti-Slavery Convention, that there was no slavery because they really had no argument against Liberia. So that was going on. Arthur Barclay, of course, like I said, he was on there as well. And so that's really what happened. But I want to really get onto that Firestone, that brief Firestone thing for World War II.
Jabari?
All right. While we wait for Jabari, we're going to play another tip, and Carl, you're going to speak to that.
Yeah, I'll actually just talk while it's going on. So this is the Harvard Expedition Team, 1926, when all of the male laborers had been removed and used to clear the rainforest of Firestone, when they needed porters to carry their load through the rainforest all the way to what is now Ganta, really. All the way, along from around Suakoko area, all those villages, it was mostly women left, pregnant women with young babies, sick men, old men. These are the people that they utilize as porters a lot of times. And so it wasn't, these people that are being carried in hammocks are Americans. The Harvard Expedition Team, white Americans, are being carried in the hammocks. You've got the frontier forces escorting them. And they entered Nimba now. You've got the drummers. It's like a whole ceremony procession headed to look at him sitting there enjoying himself, being carried by human beings. And they're wearing boots. They're being carried wearing boots, and the people carrying them are barefooted. I mean, this is how they came in and started treating our people. This is what they did. And there's so much more examples of this, but this was how they went in and utilized the people that were in that northern territory that were penetrated, that area during Howard's time, were the main ones who were abused for the Firestone plantation. They were the main ones. And it's heart-wrenching because at the point they had already come in, the Liberian government is now powerless to even protect its citizens any longer. Barclay he writes letters trying to get control of his country. It's at this point they try to involve the legislature to see if they can reverse any of this. And by 1943, it's irreversible. It's over. There's nothing Liberia can do anymore at this point because things have gotten to the entire military has been Now there's no longer frontier forces. By 1943, you now have AFL. The United States has come in. They've brought military machines. They've brought in their jeeps. They brought in all of their training, and Liberia is basically occupied now by the United States. It's the economic annexation of Liberia. In 1943, they started using U.S. currency. You've got Omega Tower. You've got RIA. Everything that the U.S. government needs, the infrastructure it needs to control the entire country has been put in place, and it is irreversible. It is irreversible.
Oh, I think there needs to be a part 2 to this.
Yeah, I think we're pretty much done. We can just breeze through this, and then we're pretty much done. This was long. Thanks for being patient, Dennis.
Yeah, no, because we have questions, we have comments, and we have callers. So
yeah, that was the end of the presentation, really. Let's go ahead. If you want to take calls, I'm still awake. I haven't fallen asleep. You awake, Jabari?
Yeah, I gotta get back on my laptop. My signal went out, so I gotta get back on my laptop. So I'm on my phone right now.
So these are just some different posters from Firestone. You can put those up while the callers are calling. I just found some old vintage photos I thought I'd put up. I mean, while these people are being enslaved, Firestone's being celebrated at the World Fair, you know. So Firestone is making America great again, taking the U.S. out of the Great Depression. I mean, Firestone rubber transformed the United States. It was a catalyst for all of these interstate highways that you see. You know, our forefathers made America great again.
And call, you know, because these are the things we continue to celebrate in Liberia, right? We have Firestone, we have Omega, we have the RIA, we have Freeport.
Voice of America, the greatest propaganda against Africa in history.
So why is that? Did we not know that really, or we are like, okay, at least we're getting something, right? Is that the case here?
Liberia had been thoroughly buck broken at this point. I mean, the exhaustion, all of the externally instigated wars, turning our people against each other, the starvation through the economic embargoes, making, you know, people who were usually self-sufficient poor, the massive labor drain out of the country, the encroachment of French and British upon our land territory, the incitement of the indigenous people against the westernized people. You know, pretty boy King coming in and saying, you know what, this is hard. I want to live that soft life, and not doing the things that those who came before him did. You know, and then the installation of a dictator and the removal of the power of our legislature, which always protected us when all else failed. They'd impeach people. Removing them and installing a dictator that had complete control of everything, including the legislature and the judiciary. That was the first time in the history of Liberia was Tubman to have control of the judiciary and the legislature. So, it was the Goliath won. Finally, David had won all those times, and now it was Goliath's reign.
Right, and we're gonna commit like 5 to 10 minutes for calls. The number is on the screen: 605-313-6004. The code is 791#. I have a question here from Dr. Pajibo. He said, yes, King appeared to be the bad guy, but are his exploits not exaggerated by his rival Faulkner, who he defeated in the presidential election? Is there not any iota of positive legacy of King?
He had beautiful children.
Yeah.
Come on, Carl.
Understand.
Yes.
Understand.
And he was a very handsome man himself.
Faulkner.
And you know,
the one that he challenges Faulkner is rigged to the max. Okay, he said that he got 245,000 votes when there were only about 20,000 or some voters there against his rival Faulkner in the People's Party. And he rigged that election. King does not win any of his elections.
So I disagree that there were only 20,000 registered voters. Some of those numbers, Jabari. So King I
but
think
he did fraud. I don't care. The numbers
yeah,
may be disputed, but he did
probably,
rig that election.
I don't know if I agree that King rigged the election. I think some of that stuff is propaganda that came later because and not from King but from the West, but because they end up turning against King later. But King was their boy. They didn't want Faulkner in there. They did because he was like Howard. Faulkner would have been like Howard. They promoted and supported King because they knew. Listen, whenever someone wants to break someone, they go to the weakest link. The guy who likes flashy things is very easy to woo with money, right? So they go in there, they push King forward, and he did have the support of the West. He was their golden child. I don't know if he rigged the election or if America rigged the election, and I don't know if those numbers are true. The source of those numbers is what's fishy to me, you know. So,
but do you believe the election was rigged?
They have him in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most rigged election in history, and you know, whatever.
Let me throw in this question, and then we bring in the callers. Jimmy Ismo said King had his issue, but it was President Daniel E. Howard who signed a new labor agreement in May 1914 with Governor General Barrera of Spain. The agreement was said to be expedient of a penurious government. The First World War injured the German-dominated Liberian economy.
Well, the British still dominated the Liberian economy, but the Liberian government was playing the European world powers against each other. What people forget is that Europeans hate each other more than Africans do. They fight each other more than Africans do. So Liberians figured that out and they used that to their advantage. There was actually nothing wrong with the labor agreement. The labor agreement is not what the problem is. The labor agreement was trying to protect Liberians who were going to Fernando Po for over 80 years, making sure that they had fair wages for their labor, because there's this huge number of people going to Fernando Po. The government intervened under Howard, and he structured it so that they would only have 2-year contracts and be free to go, and that they were paid a minimum wage of $1 a week. So the labor agreement has nothing to do with the labor crisis. The agreement itself was good.
Thank you. Because the agreement was there. I mean, you spoke of the people going to Fernando Po to work has a legitimate agreement.
Yeah.
But
the problem is taking guns when you don't have enough volunteers and forcing people.
When they couldn't, when they demanded for more laborers, and we couldn't support that, then force.
Yes.
Thank you. Let me bring in our first caller, and we have our faithful caller who religiously focus on Labrador. We appreciate you, Elvis. Mr. Elvis Morris. Go ahead, Elvis. You're live.
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Johns. Thank you to Ms. Call and to Bari. I think the presentation was,
I can predict you want to talk about King, right? All right, go ahead. I'm gonna tease him.
Because me and Willie was in the comment section, But the reality is, not even the reality. The question I had is, was it wrong under our Constitution or our laws at the time for forced labor? I won't say slave labor, but for forced labor. And if so, what did the legislators, and our representatives and senators do to hold the president accountable? Because we always talk about current day,
they impeached him.
Our president's out. Yeah, I know, but they impeached him for Fernando Po, right? Or did they impeach him for Firestone?
Oh, okay.
Right, because the Firestone thing is the one that I'm talking about, because it was happening right in our own country.
Thank you.
And if it was illegal under our laws, what did the senators or representatives do to hold the president accountable? I think it was only through international pressure that he was being held responsible for.
No. He was impeached.
I'll leave it there. I think Ms. Call can answer the question. I'll leave it
there. Thanks. Those are really good questions. And he wasn't impeached because of international pressure. They hated our legislature. Our legislature was doing its job back then. And he wasn't the first president to be impeached. And they really kept people in check. They rejected loans. They, impeached whole presidential teams in the past. But for King, his impeachment hearing was for a number of abuses and corruptions. It wasn't only Fernando Poe. And it wasn't international pressure. It was pressure from the lawmakers, the legislatures who actually adequately represented their constituents. And Firestone Agreement was one of the things that he was held accountable and was mentioned in his articles of impeachment. So as the first thing you really asked, which was an excellent question, which was forced labor. So how is forced labor defined? Nowhere in the world was forced labor illegal, especially when it came to African people. And that's because we had been so dehumanized. So in Liberia, we had a traditional system among our people, and that's why I showed the road project of compelled labor. Nobody was using gunpoint, but it was a system of instruction and obedience. The chief said, y'all go do this, okay. The chief said it's time for y'all to farm, okay. Is that forced labor? No, it's communal labor. It's something that people feel compelled to do for cultural reasons and things like that. Liberians, the laws did not allow you to make people work without money, except for in that context of the traditional people. So in Liberia, you were not supposed to go hire people and make them work and not pay them.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Let me bring in our next caller, Madison Camo. Madison, you live.
Hey, Mr. Dennis. Thanks for the opportunity. I want to say thanks to Cisco and the other panelists. This has been one of my best shows ever on focus on Liberia. I learned about this history way back in high school in Liberia, and it's so disappointing that most people don't even know about this. And Charles D.B. King, like any other Liberian who know about the history, is not my favorite president, And I understand the kind of sentiment from Cisco about Barclay. I read about him extensively, and he was really one of those who helped save Liberia independence. Without Barclay, would have been probably on a British rule or somebody else. So I want to tell her thank you for that. My only concern here is that how can the present generation today understand this history? Because we are still saying that many of our brothers and sisters are still being brainwashed when it comes to Liberian history. So at the end, they don't really take the country serious, or they don't look at themselves being proud as a Liberian, And I just don't know how we can work this out. If there's another way that some of us can come in to support the History Channel, I would like to say History Channel on Focus Africa. Come in, Mr. Dennis. I really, really love this presentation. And lastly, I think those who left willingly to go Fernando Poe, the generation today are more alive better than those who, staying at the there. Because they're doing better on our end. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. That's the last caller.
Thanks for those comments. I think it's important to know that before King, and please go back and watch the previous episodes of the previous presidents and their challenges and how they handled them. And it's incredibly important for you guys to do that, to understand why Jabari, or people who are really deeply, who have deeply studied Liberian history, get so angry at Charles D.B. King. It's because of Charles D.B. King and Tubman that people think that Liberian presidents were bad presidents. It's because of things that Charles D.B. King did that people don't even remember Edwin Barclay tried to fix it. It's because of Charles D.B. King that people don't know anything that happened before him. Mm-hmm. I've read so much stuff. I mean, the first thing I want people to, they call him, he was a miracle Liberian. Charles D.B. King's ancestors had never been to America. And, just anything they can do to try to misunderstand the history. A lot of bad things are going to happen as we proceed with the Liberian History Channel, and we start going into King's next week. We're doing Charles D.B. King. Or we're doing Howard Part 2. We're doing Howard Part 2, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to do Howard Part 2 next week, and then 2 weeks from then we're going to start with President King. President Howard made some mistakes. He did some things that I now in 2023 I can look back on and say maybe he should have done it differently. But his intentions were not malicious. And he was, as a son of indigenous people, he was really trying to pull the country together. Where people get angry with King is that he was extremely selfish in his motivations. And even when you read his speeches compared to the speeches of previous presidents, it's shocking. It's like, where did this guy come from? So he's not from the tradition of fighting for sovereignty. He had a completely different mindset.
Oh man, Brother King.
And I want to
let me read these comments and you can comment here, Jabari. Our friend William King has asked the Guinness Book of Record for proof that President King actually did that. Until today, he said he have never gotten anything from them. He would love to see if Call have any historical records from any archive, or if she can dig anything out that President King actually.
So William, you have cause. You have cause to have that removed because it's a lie. It's a lie, and there's no evidence of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is you have these people who want to slander Liberia. As it's just as much of a lie as calling very black Daniel Bashir Warner a mulatto. That's the kind of lie it is. It's a story that they tell to try to demonize this Black republic. While Charles D.B. King did some terrible things that are documented, that is not one of them. And until someone can show me primary source evidence or any kind of time period record to support that claim, I will assume it's not true. And trust me, I've looked. So you're correct, William. That it doesn't even make any sense because the legislature was so strong at that time. If he had even tried it, he would have been impeached.
Mm-hmm.
They would not have ratified the election. They would not have accepted it. It would not have happened. So it just like trying to make buffoons out of Africans is what it is, as they always do. Make up these really ridiculous buffoonish stories. The Liberian legislature was an enemy of imperialism. They hated them. Can you imagine? They couldn't even bribe the people. The British tried to bribe them to take this predatory loan, and they didn't take the money. Howard was the Secretary of the Treasury. They tried to bribe him. He didn't take the money. So this thing about people have always been corrupt in Liberia is not true. I'm not saying that your great-grandfather was a nice guy. I'm just saying that particular thing they're saying about him isn't true.
I really wanted to, before my internet went out for some real reason, maybe they wanted to stop us from spewing the facts, but I want people to understand the importance of Firestone, and it goes into one of William's comments about the reparations argument, because Firestone built its reputation, and Princeton University built its public library because of Firestone. Firestone allows for the United States to win World War II. It allows them to have all of these benefits at the backs of Liberians. And Liberians had never been compensated. There has never been any justice for those brutalities and injustices. Princeton had literally stickers, "Get Firestone." They would have a career pipeline, Princeton to Firestone, because of those rubber plantations in Liberia. And not one time have we came to that realization that we are owed the money that our ancestors, similar to how African Americans were in America, owed that money from which was taken for us. That stuff at Princeton, that prestigious university, one of the most prestigious in America, is built partially off of your ancestors. And I want us to understand why we have to learn about this so that we can demand what is rightfully due to our ancestors. Your ancestors' labor built that one of that most prestigious schools while your ancestors today are struggling, while we today are struggling.
And the labor of those people who cleared that rainforest and built that plantation with their blood, with their lives. Firestone rubber was also the catalyst for the agricultural boom in the United States. They had rubber tires for tractors. It was the catalyst for Ford Motor Corporation, the catalyst for the interstate highway system. When you're driving on Interstate 94, 80, 95, all these interstates that we use in the United States, the catalyst for all of this goes back to this rubber plantation in this little Black republic in this rainforest that was built with the blood, the sweat, the tears of our people. So when you're driving on a interstate in the United States, think about how that connects to Ford Motor and back to Firestone rubber. Rubber, the massive agriculture plantations in the United States, or these, probably when you go out to South Dakota, to Iowa, to all these places, you see these massive farms. All of that, even the war machines that allowed the Americans to come in and help the Allies to defeat the Germans. Rubber, Firestone rubber was a key, is the backbone of all of that. And this is something that they teach us in school in the United States when we're growing up. Where the rubber meets the road. Everything that brought the United States out of the Great Depression and into modernity was because of the economic annexation of Liberia and that forced labor. So I hear Elvis and others saying, oh, Charles D.B. King. Listen to me. Charles D.B. King benefited. He had one leg car, some flashy shoes, and flashy clothes. Why are you blaming the spider web and not the spider? Charles D.B. King is like just a thread of a spider web. He didn't weave the web. You cannot absolve the spider and condemn the web. He didn't weave the web. And many people argue that he had no choice. It's like, okay, they'll either crush me or I just play along so I can be comfortable.
Just roll with it.
You've got people today who aren't even faced with those kind of challenges, who are begging to be the spider web. Oh, look at me, boss. I could do it. I could do better than Weah. I'll be a better spider web than Weah. You know, I mean, come on. So y'all please get, I talk harshly because that's how I express myself. But in the greater context of things, to sit here and try to blame Charles D.B. King and act like he could have stopped forced labor at Firestone Plantation, we were already buck broken. He could not have told the U.S. to stop. He cooperated. What he could have done was removed himself from the process. He could have spoken up, but they weren't going to pay those people. They were going to do exactly what was happening in Ivory Coast. They were going to do exactly what was happening in Sierra Leone. Mm-hmm. They were going to do exactly what was happening on the Gold Coast, which was to use human beings.
Thank you. And Gwen Smith said, imagine the legislators back in the day working and impeaching officials, but nowadays they are spineless. Thank you. I also want to thank you so much. We'll get to our closing. Let me announce that tomorrow at 12 noon, the State of Women and Girls in Liberia has re-observed International Women's Day. This will come on a new day with Priscilla Ignato. You don't want to miss it. The new day comes on every Sunday at 12 noon. Jabari, let's close. Thank you all so much for the time. I really like this. And next week, Saturday, we're coming back for part 2 of President Daniel Howard. Every other Saturday, we do our president series until we get to the end. But every Saturday at 7 we have the Liberia History Channel. This is the only place we discuss this. Everywhere else, you get something else. That's why you should always tune in to Focus on Liberia, where we educate, we elevate, and promote all things Liberia. Jabari, you're closing.
It's important for us to understand what happened at Fernando Po and Firestone because the effects are still with us today. And until we understand the significance and how this damaged Liberia changed its course forever, we will never take the appropriate action. We will never do justice for our ancestors who had their destinies, their dreams, their aspirations crushed by outside forces and some participants within the administration. So it is important that we understand this. This is probably the second most significant, one of the most significant in Liberian history, and we need to understand it fully so that we can go ahead and do justice to our ancestors who were wrongfully wronged and brutally subjugated and subjected to harsh working conditions.
Thank you. Call, you're closing.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that Liberian history has been is so complicated and so inspiring. It is not all a tragic story. There are so many triumphant accomplishments. There are so many heroes. There's so much to discuss. And whenever we're talking about some of these darker periods, I always want to remind people of that. That there's still so much good that had occurred before this, that it's important to understand that balance. No country's history is all rosy and peachy. But of all of the countries that I've studied and all the world history I've studied, Liberia's story is so incredibly inspiring. We have had some of the greatest leaders in African history. We've been blessed with them. We need to resurrect their memories so that people don't have to ask these questions. Please continue to follow the Liberian History Channel for the presidential series. Please go back and watch previous episodes. They have them well organized on YouTube. You can go and click on the subject you're interested in. Going back to before Liberia was established. So it is important to, if you're driving, listen to it while you're driving or commuting or whatever. It's important to understand the full context of who we are. And I thank you for watching. It was a long episode. Break it up and watch it again. Go back and watch the previous episodes. And please join us next week for part 2 of our BASA president, President Howard.
Yes, you said it right. Our BASA president, Daniel E. Howard.
Daniel Toga.
Yeah.
Man of war.
God, thank you. Jabari, thank you. I want to thank our viewers, for those who commented, those who called, and even those who will watch later. Always focus on Liberia is the place to be. At this time, we're going to close with our song that says, "We are all Liberians." Have a good night and God bless you.
We are Liberians. Liberia is our home.